Hello and welcome to the Tradeshift Sanctuary. Today I have a wonderful panel with me to discuss the topic of China at the edge of Africa. So I'd like you all to help me welcome the panel here. We have Cherie Blair, the founder and chair of Omnia Strategies and the founder of Cherie Blair Foundation. We have Okeke, the managing director of Eclipse Live Africa. And finally, we have Stephany, the head of marketing, branding, and communications at BitPesa. Welcome, everyone.
Great to be here.
The first question I'd like to ask is, some people say that China has too much influence on Africa. Cherie, what's your take on that?
Well, what do we mean by too much? It's certainly the case that China is doing a lot of trade. It's the biggest investor in Africa. But then, if you believe in trade, this is a good thing. I think that the worry sometimes about China in Africa is the idea, which isn't true, by the way, is that China doesn't care who they give money to. And whether perhaps in the past they have given and invested unwisely, I think today China is very conscious of the fact that in today's world there are certain standards of behavior, and China, through its whole Belt and Road initiative, is very much wanting to be at the forefront of that. So when we're talking about China's relationship with Africa, I think it goes two ways. It's about China investing in Africa in a way that is holistic and honourable, and it's in the African countries responding to that. Sometimes, we talk about China and its relationship with Africa without remembering that there are plenty of European companies that are also investing in China, and some of their practices also don't stand up to scrutiny. One only has to think at the moment about Bolloré and what is happening being under investigation for corruption. I think what we need to understand, that the idea that what happened in Africa stays in Africa is no longer something that anyone can rely on, and actually everyone who does business in Africa should behave in the way and standards that they would be happy to come under scrutiny for. So. And in those bases, then China's relationship with Africa is a healthy one.
So you're saying China does not really have too much influence in Africa?
Well, look, you go on a plane in Africa, and you see English and Chinese. So China is interested. Of course, China is interested in Africa. China has a huge population. It's the second largest economy in the world. Africa is full of amazing resources. Why wouldn't China want to invest in Africa? On the other hand, the African nations, all of them, also need investment. They're looking for foreign direct investment. And from my point of view as a lawyer, I think what we need to make sure is that there's an even playing field here. And often, particularly in some of the smaller countries in Africa, where they don't have the resources, they can be faced with multinational companies, wherever they come from, lawyered up to the hilt with contracts that they've already got clauses, the most favourable clauses in, who come, and sometimes it's very difficult for these smaller countries to be able to even anticipate the pitfalls that they're signing up to. So what we need to see, I think, is a lot more investment also in building up the capacity in Africa, so that they can ensure, that the African countries can ensure that the resources that they have, that the world wants, are being utilised properly, and that the proceeds of that are spent on developing the infrastructure, the education, the future of the African people.
And Chen, what's your take? I was also thinking about the cultural impact and influence in Africa. Maybe you can also comment on that.
So I think I agree a lot with what Cherie said. I think there's always this narrative about China taking advantage of Africa. I mean, I speak as a Nigerian and an African, but obviously my experience in Nigeria. But taking advantage when it comes to bilateral agreements, I think there's a responsibility, as Cherie mentioned, for African leaders to make decisions and make deals in the best interest of their people. I think I also agree with regards to the fact that there needs to be investment with human capital, social capital, not just focused on economic growth. African countries being able to make those deals in the best interest, not just being in positions where they think it's about just the loans. Culturally, China's been in Nigeria for over 50 years, right? It's only in the last 20 years you've kind of noticed and taken notice as it becomes the superpower that it is. But culturally, the Chinese, I've lived in China, studied, worked in China, and then with the Chinese in Nigeria. The Chinese know themselves. They kind of keep to themselves, but at the same time, they don't impose their culture on anybody. They respect other cultures. And what you'll find is that anywhere where they operate within the culture and the rules of that environment. You know, when they do business in the US or in Europe, it's the same way that it's applicable in Africa. So if there's worry or concern as to the way that they do business in Africa, I think there's, as a Nigerian, it's important that we look inwards and make sure that we have the right governance in place to ensure that there's less corruption, to ensure that the funds are used properly, and for not just economic growth, but social growth as well, and human capital.
So you don't really see the impact on everyday culture, music, movies, etc., like that? That's not the kind of impact that they have in Africa?
No, I mean, look, Nollywood, for instance, the film industry, Nollywood is the second largest film industry in the world. But there's big populations of Indians and Chinese in Nigeria. They consume Chinese movies and Indian movies. There's not a lot of cross-cultural, not yet. No. I know in the last year there's been an interest in adding kind of bits of African culture to the One Road, the so-called policy. Yeah. There was a...
One Belt, One Road.
One Belt, One Road. There was a music festival which just happened in Sanya in China 2 months ago, and they had an African stage, which is the first time I've seen that kind of presence in China. That's yet to happen on the other side, but it's more in that direction.
Okay.
I think you probably see more mixing of African and indeed Chinese culture in London than you would probably do either in Beijing or Lagos.
True.
Actually.
True.
I actually think that's a problem. I think there needs to be more cultural integration between the, as a Chinese person living in Kenya, I'm constantly trying to encourage more of my Chinese friends, and because so many of the businesses that have come to China, they build their own come to Africa, they build their own dorms, they have their own restaurants. So it's actually it's almost like a business imposed kind of exclusionary culture. But then you also see, the Chinese government making a lot of effort to do that kind of integration with like the Confucius Institute that teaches Chinese for free across a number of different locations in Africa, as well as trying to bring African scholars and students to China. And I think, Chen, you're a great example of that.
Yep.
Like, someone who is who actually understands and feels the culture, because when there are those cultural differences, you see a lot of problems in the business environments as well, and trying to facilitate those conversations is also really important.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because it's Kenya, isn't it, that's starting to introduce Mandarin into the curriculum?
Yeah.
And Uganda as well, am I imagining that?
It's either Rwanda or Uganda.
It's Rwanda.
It's Rwanda.
Okay.
I think it's Rwanda. It's something that's happened on a smaller scale. I think while I lived in China, especially down south because of trade, so in Gwangju, there's a large Nigerian population of traders, and you'll find them learning Chinese, integrating, intermarrying as well. I have a friend who's half Chinese, half Nigerian that's we grew up together in Nigeria. So there's bits of that happening, but you'll find, I think, like I said before, Chinese typically have tried to keep to themselves, how to protect them, kind of the spider web theorem. Anywhere they set up, it comes in, it stays within that economy. But what you'll find is bit by bit, there's a fear, obviously, of losing of protecting their own culture. So when they start mixing, it has to be controlled, I think.
Does it work the other way with things like Chinese? I mean, Chinese food is so popular around the world. Are we seeing a Nigerian version of Chinese food or something like that?
There's like a couple of Ethiopian restaurants in China and things.
No, there's Nigerian restaurants in China. There's Chinese restaurants, but again, the Chinese food that we're all used to globally is not Chinese food that I'm used to, right? There's parts of, you've always got Chinatown everywhere. In Lagos, there's Chinese restaurants that everybody else goes to, and then there's the Chinese restaurants. In Guangzhou, I know in Beijing, there's a couple of Nigerian restaurants.
But I think one of the problems is that Chinese is a really hard language to learn. Unlike English, or French, which is spoken so much in Africa, you can come and you can teach it versus to actually speak Chinese, and that is oftentimes a barrier. And the Chinese language carries so much culture and understanding inside it, and so it's difficult to really internalize those business nuances if you don't understand the language.
So interestingly enough, I think, and I speak, again, Nigeria, there's a lot of similarities, cultural similarities. I learned Chinese in 9 months, but it's a tonal language. I don't know how to write it, but it's a tonal language, the same as many languages in Nigeria. So if you can use your ear to learn, it's quite, I wouldn't say it's easy, but it's easier than learning French or English if it's not your first language.
To be honest, I think, because you're absolutely right. So many people in Africa, all over Africa, actually already speak more than one language.
Yep.
Yeah.
Simply because of the different local languages, and they will speak probably English or French. So, and there is this, the more languages you speak, the more easy it is for you to learn others. So,
Yes.
I could actually see it might be easier for some people in Nigeria to learn Chinese than maybe some people in England, who are notoriously bad at languages often.
So, Stephany, you work with a Chinese African tech entrepreneurship program. So, you are one of the influencers from China working and operating in Africa. So, could you elaborate a little bit about?
Yeah, so I'm the founder of the China Africa Tech Initiative, and what we really focus on is how do we increase innovation and entrepreneurship and facilitating these two, especially young people in these two regions to work together. And oftentimes, there is so much technical capability in China. There's really strong education, obviously, and then there's so much opportunity across African countries. But the problem is, going back to this cultural understanding, you can put two people from very different backgrounds in a room together, and it's not always easy to facilitate what are the tangible projects that can come out of this. And I think there is still a little bit of fear of stealing IP or not really coming in with a collaborative mind. And so there are so many interesting sectors such as solar, mobile, fintech, all of those areas that Chinese entrepreneurs can really contribute to Africa. And African entrepreneurs can also bring a lot of perspective and interesting perspectives to the Chinese.
You've also talked publicly about the Chinese view on Africa, on influence there. It has matured, and maybe the debt trap that people talk about is maybe overstated, or?
So what's really interesting is currently, even with Belt and Road, the proportion of Chinese investment in Africa is actually declining. It's been doing so since about 2013. The absolute amount that is still going up. But what Chin was saying earlier, there's a narrative around infantilizing African leaders, but they go in, they've prepared proposals, they know what it is that they want. It's a negotiation process, it's a back and forth. It's not that the Chinese are just saying, here, take all of this. And if you look at the proportion of, in the beginning it was a lot of interest-free, it was grants, and then it was interest-free loans, and now there's more kind of asset financing, things like that are more complex, but moving away towards we're just giving free money which is a good and a bad thing, but I think is a part of a nuanced conversation that needs to be had.
So if we look towards the US, Trump in December launched the Prosper Africa initiative, which seems to be very much focused on trade as a means to have a bigger impact in Africa. So are US investments welcome in Africa, and can this initiative curb the Chinese?
Surely it's not a question of curbing the Chinese.
It's not a competition.
It's not. It absolutely is not a competition. There is room for American investment in Africa as there is for Chinese investment in Africa. From my own point of view, I actually find that the Chinese are more open to Africa than the Americans are. The Americans, when you talk about it, in theory say, oh yes, we see that that Africa is an interesting continent, but when it comes to actually putting their money in there, they are very hesitant about it, I think, just generally, don't you find?
I agree. I think all investment is welcome, right? I think the question is whether the US is interested in investing in Africa or willing to take that risk or spend the time to understand the nuances of investing in Africa, that it's not the same as investing in developed world. At the same time, I don't think it's about curbing Chinese influence. It's not a competition. It's not about who can give the most debt to Africa.
Well, it might be in Donald Trump's mind.
It came across that way, didn't it?
But that's not what
sounds
actually international trade is all about, is
Exactly.
it? And that's one of the problems we see with the relationship between China and America at the moment, isn't it?
Yeah.
It shouldn't be about some kind of a fight or competition and a zero-sum game.
Because we don't want to be in the middle of a pig fight, to be honest. And I feel like if China's a welcome alternative to what we've had before, and if what China's bringing to the table is better than others, then I think other alternatives have to step up and have to come with a different approach that works, not just about loans, but also seeing where there's investment opportunities, investment partnerships, where we're looking at developing Africa as opposed to just enslaving Africa with more debt, helping them understand. I think responsibility sits on both sides of those agreements, where if it doesn't work and you know that they can't, if you look at their gross national income, they can't afford to service the debt, why are you giving them that loan, right? But at the same time, in the private sector, you see a lot of private sector investment on the Chinese front, telcos, mining, manufacturing, where what's been, I think, is very different from the past is they're adding value in Africa, not just interested in natural resources, shipping it out and looking at us as consumers. I think, yes, through trade, China does look at Africa as a big consumer, but looking forward to the next 20, 30 years, I think anybody interested in investing in Africa has to look at it from not just from our selfish point of view, which is we want to develop and grow economically, but also the importance of developing Africa in the big scheme of things globally for international trade, but also looking at Africa as a producer as opposed to a consumer. If you take agriculture, for instance, food security. If you don't develop Africa over the next 20 years, food security will become an issue globally. And so those are the kind of partnerships and I think investment opportunities that exist within Africa, not just loading us with more and more debt.
I'm sure partnership is definitely the key here. It's not about an attitude of someone who's a recipient and someone who's this benefactor.
Exactly.
It's actually about working together, and that means going beyond extractives and taking value out of Africa. It's all about how do we help Africa develop value within Africa so that they can service their youth population, so that there are jobs and opportunities, so that the market can expand as the African middle class grows, which in its turn gives more opportunities for people who are wanting to sell services and more sophisticated goods. And that's the virtuous circle of trade.
And that all happened much more recently in China than in the US, right? So if you look at Chinese investors who are investing in early internet companies, when Alibaba, Tencent, all those big guys started in the late or the 1980s, internet penetration was 1.2%, right? So a lot of Chinese investors understand how to invest in high-risk but high-growth companies. I think arguably better than a lot of American investors who have kind of a more conservative, they would rather invest in a later-stage company rather than really investing in things like supply chain, production, all of those things that need to go into some of the companies that are really burgeoning in Africa right now.
So are loans a good way for Western companies to assist developing nations, or what are we looking for?
Well, it depends on the terms, surely.
Yes.
some loans on good terms can be
Helpful.
helpful. On stringent and unfair terms, they're helpful to nobody, are they?
Right, and I don't think that loans are the only way. I think what we just said earlier, investment, I think, and focus on human capital, in education, health, building capacity, because I think there's such a focus on growth and economic growth. There's maybe this false idea that if we grow economically, the rest will follow just because you've got money. But there's a big gap, especially in Nigeria, when it comes to capacity, education, job opportunities. That's declining. Yes, we might be growing, the GDP is growing, but there's a big gap when it comes to human capital development.
Yeah.
I think what I'm interested in relation to China, I mean, compared to the rest of the world, I think in the rest of the world now, in our interconnected world, there's a lot more awareness and interest both from governments and from consumers about good practices in relation to companies that are investing wherever they're investing. People are concerned about slavery in the supply chain. People are concerned about extractive industries polluting the environment. And there's a lot of pressure through government, through consumers, through investors on, want of a better word, Western countries to conform to that. What I'm not sure about is whether we see a trend like that in China too.
There are a lot of large companies. You hear a lot of negative, right? The guys who are building in the roads and the bridges and all of that, and how they kind of import their Chinese workers in and then they, take them out. But there's also a lot of large Chinese companies like Huawei that do a lot of capacity building. They have a lot of training programs that are on the ground. Fosun is now building their first pharmacy somewhere in West Africa. I can't remember exactly where. But anytime you have that kind of really intentional selection and growth of a company in a region, then you are inadvertently, building capacity through that as well. That economic prosperity has a lot of external effects as well.
And of course, if you actually want to employ workforce locally, there's an incentive for you to help build up your workforce of the future by investing in education, in training, and all the things that one would expect if you're going. And that again is beneficial to host country as well as to the incoming country.
And I think going back to this, is there more social justice? Is there more awareness? Certainly in the younger generation in China, it's huge now, right? And a lot of people are very interested in China about Africa in terms of sustainability, in terms of the environmental protection, all of those things. So there is that growing interest as well.
The social credit indices now, don't you?
What about the social credit?
Indices based on your social credit, whether you could get credit or not based on the way that you are socially?
The social credit index is more about but that social index is based on your behavior according to Chinese communist system, and less about how much you care about social justice.
I think a good example based on what you just said is Techno, the mobile phones. They recently built a product design lab in Lagos to start basically developing products locally and designing. And I think once you start thinking that way, the next phase is how do you start manufacturing locally as well.
Yeah.
But I think this isn't just about China. This is about world trade in general, and how, as we move forward into the future, what kind of world do we want to see? Are we going to see a world that's interconnected and respectful of each other, and that benefits from helping growth everywhere? Or are we seeing a place where it's all about me and how much money can I get, which is, I'm afraid in some parts of Africa is still a really difficult problem. One only has to look at what's happened in the DRC, where a corrupt ruler has just gone through a sham of an election, and when the people have responded and said, we want to change, he's just said, oh no, sorry, I'm still going to be here. I mean, that's a problem that corrupt rulers, and eventually corrupt rulers have to change.
I think I concur. As much as we can point at China, it's what happens when you're at the top, right? Everybody's all eyes on you. But for me, from a Nigerian perspective, I'd rather look inwards. I'm more interested in accountability of African leaders. Corruption, yes, but I think just, living in China, one thing that's clear is the Chinese are in it for the Chinese, right? We all understand that. My question is Africa in it for Africa. There's many instances where you'll question that, and short-sighted, selfish deals which benefit individuals as opposed to nations. Countries that are defaulting on their loans, I don't think are based on the country not being able to service them, but it's about managing those poorly, bad governance. And I think that's where, from an African perspective, that's where a lot of focus needs to be, is how do we get to a point where we can hold ourselves accountable and responsible for that.
Yeah, but I see myself, your generation in Africa are very much more demanding of their leaders. They're very much more socially aware. They want a better Africa. They are offended by the idea of that kind of Africa. And so we are seeing a new generation coming up, and that we are seeing transformation in that front. Not fast enough, but it's happening.
I agree. There's a lot of socially aware and talking about it. There's not enough doing. I'm part of that generation, and it's nice talking about it on social media, expressing your views. I live in a country where I don't see that involvement from the youth. Getting involved. I have a few friends, we've got elections in 4 weeks, and there's not enough representation from this generation that we speak of, whether in voting or actually getting involved in politics. And that's what has to change. Yeah.
So China is becoming the new superpower. What's the impact on prosperity and trade on Africa? So,
well, I think this is not just about China. If you look at what the fastest, the biggest economies in the world now, and you look at Britain, for example, is 5th or 6th, depending on whether you say France is ahead of us or behind us. Since Brexit, probably 6th. But when you look at those companies, Germany, France, UK, China, Japan, US. If you look 2050 and you look at who are going to be the big economies in the world, well, you're going to find France, Germany, UK still in the top 10, but down at the bottom end of that top 10 and far behind the big economies, which will be China,
Brazil,
India, Brazil. What we're talking about is a world where population size and your markets, the actual local market size, is going to represent your power.
So we have to wrap up now, but I'd like to, a quick question to each of you. What can Africa offer China? Who would like to?
I was going to say youth.
Yeah.
Youth? Yes.
Mine's got a lot of youth.
Chen?
Partnership.
Partnership. Stephany?
A lot of light and energy, I think, goes back to the youth.
So thank you for joining this panel. I realized I forgot to introduce myself when we started out. My name is Mikkel, Hippe, Brun. I'm co-founder of Tradeshift. I run our business in China for more than 5 years. Thank you so much.
Okay, so let me ask you then. What do you say,
That's a good one. I should have. Yeah. You caught me there, Cherie. But trade, culture. I would love to see more cultural influence in China. The music festivals and the music influence. Chinese, they love singing. They love karaoke. Let's have some more African music in the KTV houses in China.
Why not? Okay.
So please join me in a warm thanks to our panel.